Corrib's an issue that I've been involved in as an activist for a number of years, and I haven't really done any kind of serious reflection or theoretical reflection on it, and this is a kind of a bit of a first in that respect. I have two arguments really. Firstly, that Corib in a sense is a microcosm for the political economy of Ireland, and it's an opportunity, looking at through the prism of Corib, is an opportunity to shed light on crucial aspects of Ireland today, including, I would argue, the definition and the role of civil society, or what calls itself civil society, and also the nature of the Irish state. And in that sense, as Micheál said this morning, I think it vindicates the usefulness of a historical materialist approach. Marxism as a way of thinking works very well vis-a-vis this particular issue. But I think Corib also poses, and this is my second argument, poses challenges to the standard historical materialist recipe for resistance and revolution, and it poses challenges to what I might term traditional left thinking in that regard. Now, I'm going to have to assume a reasonable amount of knowledge on the part of people about the project. This slide indicates its geographical location, the location of the actual gas field, and where it's to be taken ashore. And I'll have a more detailed map of that anon. The Corib gas field is variously estimated in terms of its value, but most estimates indicate that it's in the region of about 10 billion euros worth of gas. The state, the Irish state, the Irish people have no share whatever in that gas field. Shell has a 45% stake. The Norwegian largely state-owned company Statoil has 36.5%. Vermilion, a Canadian company, has 18.5%. The project consists of what I've termed here 4 elements, but in fact it might be better described as 5, really, I realised in retrospect. The first is the rig, the actual rig from which the gas will be pumped from below the surface of the sea. Then you've got an offshore pipeline, which was laid in the midst of some controversy. Year before last, Solitaire, the world's largest pipeline vessel, was finally able to lay that pipeline. That pipeline runs to a landfall site at Glengad in Mayo, and then it has to get to here, which is Bellinaboy, which is the refinery, which is now more or less completely built. One of the features of this project is that each stage has its own different planning permission. So they have permission for the refinery, but they don't have permission for the pipeline, the onshore pipeline, which will bring unrefined gas, raw gas, unstable gas, 9 kilometres. The lines you see there, the red line and the green line, represent 2 routes that have been rejected in different ways, initially withdrawn and then rejected by An Bord Pleanála. Currently, the proposal that has been the subject of an An Bord Pleanála hearing is to pipe through the bay, through Schwadigan Bay, up to the landfall, up to the refinery site. And it's that pipeline, it's the other aspects of the project are controversial, but it's that pipeline that has been the principal focus of people's concerns since the early part of the protests. At an An Bord Pleanála hearing on this most recent proposed pipeline route, Shell consultants admitted that in the event of a gas leak, houses within 230 metres of the pipeline could burn spontaneously from heat radiation. And confidence has not been boosted by persistent breaches of health and safety regulations in the area. And hence that concern about the onshore pipeline is where the name Shell to Sea comes from. They wanted the gas refined offshore, and a pipeline, if there was to be a pipeline onshore, it would be piping refined and much more stable and much less dangerous gas. So while that's been the core of especially the local protest, there are also wider protests as well. Both Broadhaven Bay and Schwadigan Bay are special areas of conservation or special protection areas, quite rare marine and bird life. Fisher people have been very concerned about the offshore pipeline and the possible emissions that might have in terms of fish stocks. There's also, of course, wider global concerns about burning of fossil fuels and whether that's something that we should be doing. However, the issue, and I suppose where the political economy of plunder comes in, is the wider, not just environmental, but also wider material concerns that the project has thrown up. It's not just around Corib, but Corib is the prototype in many ways for proposed exploration of oil and gas off the west coast of Ireland, and indeed the south coast as well. Total oil and gas reserves off the west coast of Ireland are estimated may amount to more than 400 billion euros, which rather dwarfs even the ginormous figures that Kieran was referring to this morning in terms of bank bailouts and so on. In the mid-1970s, Labour minister, and this obviously pertains to debates about Labour in government and so on, it also pertains to debates about the times we live in, Justin Keating, as Minister for Energy, proposed that this would be oil and gas would be developed in a kind of a cooperative basis between multinational companies and the state. The state would have a 50% stakeholding, the state would get royalty payments, there would be a 50% tax take also, and there would be development of an Irish Petroleum Corporation, which would be essentially along the Norwegian model. A state-owned company would work alongside multinational companies to ensure, A, that the state got a stake in this, but also that the state built up the expertise to be able to develop future oil and gas reserves themselves. And interestingly, at the time, that was Keating's proposals were the subject of very vigorous denunciation by some on the left, selling out to multinational capital, including a very young Eamon Gilmore, for those of you who are interested in transformations in this area. Though Keating's proposed terms were relaxed progressively over time, most notably by Ray Burke during his period of tenure as Energy Minister. During one famous meeting, Burke asked that his civil servants leave the room while he spoke to representatives of Shell and others. And we gradually had a progressive relaxation and a shift, if you like, a shift in some ways, I'll come back to this later, from a kind of a developmental state model to some extent, in a fairly mild form, to a very straightforward neoliberal model. The current terms are, as I mentioned, the state has no shareholding in the current gas field or in any other oil or gas find. There are no royalty payments. The company only has to pay 25% tax on its profits. That may rise to 40% in the case of very high levels of profit in the future. But those taxes only kick in after all costs have been offset, including the cost of closing down the infrastructure once used up. Ireland, the argument is often made, this guarantees Ireland's energy security. It doesn't. Ireland buys the gas at the full market price if Shell and its partners are good enough to sell it to Ireland. So there is no advantage to Ireland in that regard. And that can be contrasted, I think, with renegotiations of oil and gas deals in other countries around the world. Mick McCaughan and I have written a pamphlet for AFRI, the NGO that I'm associated with, on how countries like Russia and Bolivia, Brazil and Venezuela have renegotiated deals the companies have not pulled out. And this is not like footloose international capital in other areas. You know, if you're making clothes or you're making electronics, you can do it in Hungary, or you can do it in China, or you can do it in Ireland. There's nowhere else in the world you can get current gas. There is a negotiating position here. But I think what it indicates is the dependent and the deferential nature of the Irish state towards external power. And I'll come back to that again later on. But at the same time, a deeply repressive attitude towards the citizenry. And though any of us who've been involved in this campaign for a number of years know the extent to which the state will go in this area is pretty much unlimited. We had the jailing of the Rossport five local farmers who refused to sign a court order allowing Shell to do exploratory work on the pipeline across their land. They were held in prison for 94 days. We've had very serious assaults on protesters. Willie Corduff, a mild-mannered middle-aged farmer, one of the Rossport Five, was beaten up very severely by unidentified masked men during a peaceful protest. Pat O'Donnell, a local fisherman who has been very vigorously opposed to the project, had his boat sunk by unidentified armed men, and he himself then, to add insult to injury, was jailed on trumped-up charges of assault and spent quite a chunk of earlier this year in jail. Those abuses have been documented by Action from Ireland, which is an NGO I work with, in terms of human rights monitoring, but also by some more mainstream sources, such as the Frontline Human Rights Defenders Organisation, a report compiled by the solicitor Brian Barrington, which documented this, but which received remarkably little media coverage, and that's something I'll come back to. We've also had, apart from official state repression in the area, there's also been a very prominent role played by non-state actors, and in particular by a private security firm, Integrated Risk Management Systems, which has very shadowy, which subsequently proved to have very shadowy links with international mercenary networks. Michael Dwyer, a young Irishman who worked for them, was put in touch with Croatian, Bolivian mercenary groups and ended up subsequently being killed by Bolivian police when involved in what seems to have been a coup or assassination attempt against the Morales government in Bolivia. So we have some very sinister forces at work here. It's not just the police. You can see this same pattern, or it's not just security. You can see the same pattern if you look at the planning system, the bending over backwards to facilitate capital and corporations, while rendering local people's ability to try and exercise their citizenship rights extremely difficult. The planning procedure, which is supposed to be independent, has been consistently and quite overtly interfered with after Shell's original refinery site was turned down. Bertie Ahern personally met with Shell and urged them to reapply. The Department of the Marine has routinely queried the basis on which on board Planola decisions have been made. There's been a threat of fast-tracking critical infrastructure legislation that would take some of this area out of the remit of the planning board. There's been project splitting, as I mentioned earlier. Different parts of the project have had permission broken up into different areas. So there's never been a holistic single assessment of the planning procedure. Now that's not a homogeneous picture. There have been reversals. In 2003, a Board Planola inspector initially rejected the first refinery site that was overturned, and last year the most recent onshore pipeline route was also rejected by Board Planola. So there have been some reverses, largely due to the extraordinary doggedness and persistence and accrued expert status of local residents who have presented unassailable cases around health and safety concerns in particular. But they have had to contend in a very serious way with the weight of the state on board Planola up to a point, the Gardaí to a very significant point, the Navy was deployed to protect the Solitaire and the lane of the offshore pipeline. Other regulatory bodies there, the Garda Ombudsman Commission, for example, has for the most part refused to take complaints about Garda behaviour seriously. We've also had, for the first time in the state, the deployment of compulsory purchase orders against private landholders. These had never been used in this way before. The courts have generally weighed in on behalf of the state and corporations. And we've also had repression of civil societies, and I'll come back to civil society in a moment. Civil society groups that have tried to protest this have suffered consequences. My own organisation, AFRI, had funding challenged because we made the outrageous comparison of comparing Willie Corduff to Ken Saro-Wiwa. But it's been more serious for others. The Centre for Public Inquiry, which produced a very comprehensive report on this issue, was shafted by Michael McDowell shortly after that report was published, in probably not unrelated, not a coincidence, I don't think. And that, in a sense, brings me to one of the core points that I think is important in terms of understanding where our understanding of Irish society and the possibilities for resistance. Despite that repression, the civil society response has been very dynamic in the area and nationally. Shell to Sea has been one of the most well-networked, most dynamic, imaginative, innovative protest movements in this country in recent years. It's built up tremendous international networked contacts in Norway, but also in the Niger Delta and elsewhere. And also local community groups, Pobal Kilcommon, Pobal Acela, local groups who are opposed to the project. But they are overburdened, they're divided, but they've still kept going. More broadly, they've got very little support from civil society in Ireland, which has opted for, this goes back to what Kieran was talking about, social partnership. Most civil society groups in Ireland are very disciplined, they're very controlled, they're in service delivery mode, they're dependent upon state funding. The so-called global justice NGOs, environmental NGOs, who are very happy to talk about environmental pollution or abuses of human rights in the Niger Delta, have been overwhelmingly quiet on this issue. Some of you may be familiar with the Reclaiming Our Future or Claiming Our Future conference that's coming up on the 30th of October, a kind of a broad-based civil society positing of alternatives. I would be sceptical around where that will go, given the kind of predominant professionalised nature of the NGOs involved. There have been exceptions, our own, I would say. Antashka, I think, has been an interesting example in terms of weighing in here. And I think this does raise a wider point about civil society in Ireland. What it should be doing, which in terms of an elite view, what it should be doing is engaging civilly with the state. And I think state and private philanthropy funding has tried to mould civil society in that image. And in a sense, what we have here is a Gramscian concept of civil society alongside the state being political society and this type of civil society, where the state represents, where political society represents coercion, and this type of civil society represents the winning of consent. Kind of a good cop, bad cop routine, to put it in less theoretical terms, I think, in some ways. actually existing civil society as opposed to that prescriptive model, such as the Erris community or Shell to Sea, I do think represent networks of resistance, what Kieran was talking about. They have a very different, much more contestatory relationship to the state, to political society. They're much less civil, they're much more genuinely representative, and because they're much less civil, they've been prone to much more attack, including in the media, which has been a key fulcrum for that attack. They've been ignored, especially on the resources issue, which has received scant coverage. Where they haven't been ignored, they've been demonised, such as through the TV3 documentary by Paul Williams and Jerry Gregg, Battle for the Corrib gas field. Paul Williams, the crime correspondent of the, is it the News of the World now he's gone to? Yeah. Or King Scumbag, as I prefer to refer to. Kevin Myers. There have been exceptions in that regard, and it's important to record those. But the overwhelming picture has been to ignore these issues, and in part, that feeds into them, or that stems from, quite direct corporate influence. You've got a civil society corporate media network here. Former journalists have been recruited as PR people, or indeed in the case of John Egan as actually chief executive of Shell. Paul Williams enjoyed hospitality in Croke Park in the Shell corporate box. Former Gardaí have been recruited as security specialists by Shell and by IRMS. The Secretary of Mayo County Council has been brought on board, once retired. Local community groups get grants, arts, etc. groups, including water safety programmes in local schools, most recently was funded by Shell. The Bishop of Killala blessed the rig from a helicopter back in the year 2000. You really couldn't make some of this stuff up. In the film version, he has to be played by Father Jack. But, I think, apart from the direct corporate influence, this also tells us something about the Irish state. It's corrupt and it's cronyist, it's crude in the sense that Kieran referred to, but it's also deeply dependent. This is not a developmental state a la Sean O'Rian's theories of the Irish state, and while I have a lot of time for Mary Murphy and Peadar Kirby's conceptualisation of the Irish state as a competition state, it's not really a competition state either. A genuine competition state that was trying to promote competitiveness would be using the royalty payments from this to fund education and research and development and technological innovation. Instead, what we have is a state that governs in large part on behalf of US capital and other foreign investment, and of course more recently in terms of the financial crisis, on behalf of European capital as mediated through the ECB. I think that prompts questions. I'll leave that last question there to come back to. I think challenges for the left. I think one is that nationalism is a very prominent part of this struggle. It's very strong at the local level. It probably puts people off. I think if you look at the pre-budget submissions by groups like TASC and Social Justice Ireland, resources is the elephant in the room. It's not mentioned. And I think there's also a certain fear that because extremist Republicans are claimed to be associated with the protests, that may also put people off. But I think the only issue can only be framed in national terms. The only repository of ownership here can be the Irish people. And I think reclaiming our resources is the only way in which that social justice demand can be meaningfully expressed. Quote from the Communist Manifesto, because we are at a Marxist conference, that this struggle, at some sense, in form, if not in substance, has to take a national form. I think another challenge to the left, and this will be my last point, another challenge to the left is the way in which the campaign at a local level especially is suffused with a sense of place, understood as a site of culture, language, memory, belief, belonging, something that cannot be materially valued. It is, as Mark Garavan or Sheila Killian's work here has pointed out, a different way of being in the world that I think may seem quite reactionary or almost archaic to a standard left programme. I know Marx has mistranslated on the idiocy of rural life. It's really the isolation of rural life. But nonetheless, I think that notion is perhaps quite challenging to a kind of a crude materialist position. And just a couple of quotes on that. Willie Corduff, one of the protesters, talking about being born and reared on this farm, the memories, the notion of footsteps, this notion of a deep connection to place. And he is opposing, he probably wouldn't want to be posited in this way, but he is opposing Roy Foster's rootless cosmopolitanism to some extent that Kieran quoted earlier. And I've quoted Rosa Luxemburg here about imperialism conquering the non-capitalist environment. Now Willie's doesn't inhabit a non-capitalist environment, but he inhabits some other space that I think is important in terms of a resistance to a totalizing capitalism that seeks to subsume all social life worlds. This is a quote from Pat O'Donnell, again talking about some sense of stewardship or responsibility to the sea. I think you can link that into wider global debates about the privatisation of natural resources, the enclosure of the commons, and so on, such as Vandana Shiva's quote about corporations conquering the world, in a sense, in terms of biodiversity and water. But I'll tell you, trying to get Pat O'Donnell on board a Marxist programme for transformation of Irish society would be quite a challenge. But we're going to have to. And that's my last point. You know, we're going to have to. We need some kind of diverse programme that allows different people's way of being in the world to flourish at an autonomous and a local level, in a non-mechanistic kind of Marxist way, a kind of a decentralised autonomies that would cover not just rural areas but also urban community regeneration, genetic diversity, in a sense reclaiming that kind of the Zapatista slogan of the one no and the many yeses, framed within a nationally framed programme asserting the right of ownership, and also at some level that has some sense of global responsibility. Now, of course, another question that I'll leave with is, might that sense of global responsibility be sufficient to actually leave the resource in the ground altogether? I don't know. That's a question we may have to face, but for now, I think Corrib serves as a model for what the Irish state and Irish civil society really are, but also as a model for how resistance might be formulated. Thanks.